In the heart of Wilkes County, Alabama, where dense forests still guard secrets buried for over a century, there exists a story that challenges our understanding of the limits of maternal obsession and human isolation. Between 1854 and 1863, a property called Cypress Bend became the stage for events that reveal how trauma can transform victims into perpetrators and how distorted love can be as destructive as hatred. This is one of the most disturbing stories I've ever heard about the antebellum South. A period where the brutality of slavery created conditions for social experiments that tested the limits of human degradation. Cypress Bend wasn't just a declining plantation. It was an involuntary laboratory where a traumatized woman tried to recreate the family she had lost with consequences that echo through generations. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this is your first time on the channel, and if you enjoy stories that explore the darker aspects of human nature, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. The year 1854 found Arthur Claybornne contemplating the dusty windows of his grand house, observing fields that once rippled with cotton white as snow. At 41, he was a man who had inherited more debts than land, more pride than resources. Cypress Bend, with its 800 acres in the most remote region of Wilkes County, Alabama, had been his father's dream. But now it was his nightmare. Financial records from the era paint a devastating picture. Mortgages accumulated like storms on the horizon, and creditors from Mobile began making increasingly frequent visits. Arthur had sold most of his slaves in previous years, leaving only 6 men led by Isidore, a 30-year-old man whose physical strength was legendary in the region, and Hattie, a 60-year-old woman who cared for the grand house. Dorothy Claybornne, at 36, watched her family's decline with a mixture of terror and determination. Married to Arthur for 15 years, she had grown accustomed to the luxuries the plantation provided. Now she faced the prospect of losing everything. The house, the land, the social status that defined her identity. Arthur's peculiar solution began to take shape during the long winter nights. He had observed other plantations in the region that specialized not in agricultural production, but in breeding slaves for sale. It was a lucrative business, and in his desperate mind represented Cypress Bend's salvation. The plan was simple in its cruelty. Transform the plantation into a human nursery. Arthur would use his last savings to acquire young women of reproductive age and force them to conceive. The children would be sold, generating the capital needed to save the property. It was a long-term investment that required only that he abandon the last vestiges of his humanity. In April 1854, Arthur made his first transaction. He traded 2 of his older slaves for Lena, an 18-year-old girl, and Beatrice, 20. Both had been separated from their families on neighboring plantations, a detail Arthur considered advantageous. Women without close family ties would be less prone to resistance. Dorothy initially opposed the plan, not for moral reasons, but for practical concerns about how to feed more mouths when they could barely sustain those they had. But Arthur had calculated everything. The women would work in the fields during pregnancy, and after birth, the babies would be sold quickly, minimizing maintenance costs. The arrival of Lena and Beatrice at Cypress Bend marked the beginning of a new era of horror. Arthur had converted an old slave quarters at the back of the property, dividing it into small windowless rooms where the women would be housed. Each space had only a straw bed, a bucket, and a small opening for ventilation. Hattie was instructed to prepare the accommodations, a task she performed in silence, her eyes revealing a somber understanding of what was to come. The first weeks were dedicated to what Arthur euphemistically called acclimatization. Lena and Beatrice were informed about their new functions. A conversation Dorothy witnessed from the doorway, observing how her husband's face transformed as he explained his expectations. It was as if she were seeing a stranger inhabiting Arthur's body. The daily regime at Cypress Bend became a routine of systematic degradation. The women worked in the fields during the day under Isidore's supervision, who had been instructed to maintain distance. At night, Arthur visited them in their rooms, a practice he justified as necessary for the success of the enterprise. Dorothy began observing the changes in her husband with growing discomfort. During private conversations, she noticed how Arthur spoke about the women as if they were livestock, calculating their productive potential with a coldness that disturbed her. Gradually, she began accepting Arthur's logic. Their survival depended on the success of this plan. Months passed without results. Lena and Beatrice weren't getting pregnant, a fact that frustrated Arthur deeply. He began questioning whether he had made a bad deal, whether the women were defective in some way. His frustration manifested in increasingly severe punishments, reduced rations, prolonged isolation, physical punishments that left visible marks. Dorothy watched these punishments with growing discomfort, but also with disturbing curiosity. She began participating in the disciplinary sessions, initially as an observer, then as an active participant. Gradually, she began accepting that the women needed to understand the importance of their function. Financial pressure continued to intensify. Mobile creditors sent representatives to evaluate the property, suited men who walked through the fields with calculating gazes. Arthur knew he had little time before Cypress Bend would be confiscated. His obsession with the reproductive project became even more intense. In September 1854, Arthur made a decision that would reveal the true extent of his moral degradation. He decided to test Lena and Beatrice with Isidore, an experiment he rationalized as scientific. If the women didn't respond to him, perhaps they would respond to another man. It was cold logic that completely ignored the humanity of everyone involved. The proposal was presented to Isidore as an order, not a choice. The man who had led other slaves with dignity and strength now faced a situation that would test his own survival. Refusing would mean severe punishment, possibly death. Accepting meant participating in the degradation of innocent women. Dorothy observed Isidore's reaction during the conversation with Arthur. The man looked at his master as if seeing the devil himself, but nodded slowly. What choice did he have? It was a power dynamic that Dorothy was beginning to understand with disturbing clarity. Implementation of the new system began in October 1854. Arthur had created a detailed schedule determining when and how the encounters would occur. It was a business-like approach to what was essentially systematized rape, a bureaucratization of horror that made the acts even more disturbing. The first weeks of the new regime were marked by palpable tension at Cypress Bend. Hattie moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Isidore worked in the fields with fierce intensity, as if he could exorcise his demons through physical labor. Lena and Beatrice became even more withdrawn, their personalities fragmenting under the weight of systematic brutality. Dorothy began assuming a more active role in administering the program. She created simple records, noting dates and basic observations about the women's behavior. It was an approach that helped her emotionally distance herself from the reality of what was happening. In December 1854, the first signs of success appeared. Lena began showing symptoms of pregnancy, followed by Beatrice a few weeks later. Arthur was euphoric, seeing confirmation that his plan would work. Dorothy felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief because financial pressure might decrease. Horror because she now faced the reality of babies being born at Cypress Bend. The women's pregnancies marked a new phase in Dorothy's transformation. She began personally supervising their care, not out of compassion, but to protect the investment. Her observations became more detailed, recording every aspect of the pregnant women's health and behavior. The winter of 1854-1855 was particularly harsh and conditions at Cypress Bend deteriorated further. Food was scarce, heating fuel limited, and tension among all plantation inhabitants reached dangerous levels. It was a toxic environment where humanity was being systematically destroyed, setting the stage for even more disturbing revelations. Arthur began making plans to expand the program. He spoke about acquiring more women, about transforming Cypress Bend into the region's largest nursery. His ambitions grew proportionally to his disconnection from moral reality, a progression Dorothy watched with growing fascination and terror. The final months of 1854 established the patterns that would define the coming years at Cypress Bend. The plantation had transformed from a declining agricultural property into something much more sinister. A laboratory of human degradation, where the limits of cruelty would be constantly tested and expanded. The year 1855 brought the first fruits of Arthur Clayborne's macabre plan. In March, Lena gave birth to a boy, followed by Beatrice in April with a girl. The birth should have been moments of celebration for Arthur, confirmation that his investment was yielding dividends. Instead, they became the catalyst for a revelation that would shake the foundations of his masculine identity. The babies were undeniably Isidore's children. Their physical characteristics left no doubt about paternity, a fact Arthur initially tried to ignore. But reality became impossible to deny when he mentally compared these successful births with his own failed efforts with Lena and Beatrice for months. Later, records found on the property revealed that it was Dorothy who first confronted Arthur with the truth about his infertility. The discovery devastated not only Arthur's masculine pride, but his entire perception of himself as patriarch and continuator of the Clayborne lineage. The revelation also explained why Dorothy had never conceived during 15 years of marriage. Arthur's reaction to the revelation was initially violent denial, but gradually denial gave way to cold rage that would turn against everyone around him. If he couldn't be a father, at least he would be the architect of a system that generated profit through others' paternity. The discovery of his own infertility removed the last vestiges of moral restraint Arthur still maintained. Dorothy observed her husband's transformation with a mixture of fascination and horror. The man she had married was disappearing, replaced by something colder and more calculating. Later testimonies from Hattie describe how Dorothy began expressing growing concern about the changes she saw in Arthur during this period. The sale of the first babies occurred in May 1855. Arthur had established contacts with slave traders in Mobile men who asked minimal questions about the origin of the merchandise. Lena's boy was sold for $250, Beatrice's girl for $200. It was enough money to temporarily relieve creditor pressure, but Arthur was already planning significant expansion of the business. The separation of babies from their mothers was a spectacle of cruelty that deeply marked everyone present. Later accounts describe how Lena collapsed when her son was torn from her arms, her screams echoing across the property for days. Beatrice became catatonic, refusing to eat or speak. Hattie observed everything in silence, her tears being the only evidence of her remaining humanity. Dorothy tried to rationalize what she witnessed through justifications she would repeat in the following months. It was a way to protect her mental sanity from the reality of what she was participating in. Convincing herself that the separations were necessary for the family's survival. With initial success confirmed, Arthur began implementing the second phase of his plan. He used part of the profits to acquire more young women, expanding Cypress Bend's reproductive stock. In June, Sarah, 17, and Rebecca, 19, arrived. Both purchased from plantations in similar financial difficulties. The arrival of new women required reorganization of Cypress Bend's physical structure. Arthur expanded the converted slave quarters, creating additional compartments that would serve as reproductive lodgings. Each space had only a straw bed, a bucket, and a small opening for ventilation. It was architecture of dehumanization, designed to reduce women to their basic reproductive functions. Isidore, now recognized as the operation's primary breeder, faced his own form of psychological torture. Arthur had established a rigid schedule for his duties, treating him like a valuable breeding animal. The man who once led other slaves with dignity was now reduced to a purely biological function. His humanity denied even more systematically. Dorothy assumed the role of reproductive operations supervisor, a position she embraced with disturbing efficiency. Evidence found decades later shows she maintained basic records of each woman, observing cycles and behaviors. It was simple bureaucracy of horror that transformed human lives into practical observations. The summer of 1855 brought new challenges to Cypress Bend's operation. Alabama's intense heat made conditions in the slave quarters almost unbearable, and several women became seriously ill. Arthur refused to spend money on adequate medical care, viewing illnesses as acceptable operational costs. In his enterprise, the women's resistance manifested in subtle but persistent ways. Some tried to induce abortions using herbs that Hattie secretly provided. Others refused to eat, preferring slow death to continuation of their torture. Arthur responded to each act of resistance with increasingly severe punishments, creating a cycle of brutality that constantly intensified. Dorothy began participating directly in punishments, an evolution she justified as necessary to maintain discipline. Her transformation from reluctant observer to active participant revealed how the system was shaping her own psyche in disturbing ways. In September 1855, Sarah and Rebecca confirmed their first pregnancies, further validating Arthur's system. But success brought new problems. The property now housed 4 pregnant women simultaneously, requiring resources Arthur could barely provide. He began cutting rations even further, arguing that pregnant women needed less food than field workers. Deterioration of conditions at Cypress Bend accelerated during autumn. The women, weakened by malnutrition and constant stress, began suffering pregnancy complications. 2 lost their babies, events Arthur coldly recorded as operational losses in his financial calculations. Humanity had been completely extracted from the equation had he emerged as a central figure of silent resistance during this period. The elderly woman used her knowledge of herbs and traditional medicine to secretly alleviate the suffering of younger women. She provided teas to reduce pain, ointments to heal wounds, and most importantly, a maternal presence that offered some comfort. Amid the horror, Dorothy began suspecting Hattie's activities, but initially chose to ignore them. There was something in the older woman's silent dignity that still touched some vestige of humanity in Dorothy. But this tolerance would be tested when Dorothy's interests aligned more directly with the system she helped administer. The winter of 1855–1856 was particularly brutal both meteorologically and in terms of conditions at Cypress Bend. Intense cold made the slave quarters almost uninhabitable and several women developed pneumonia. Arthur refused to provide additional fuel, arguing that cold would strengthen the survivors. During this period, Dorothy began experiencing profound psychological changes. Later accounts from Hattie describe a woman struggling with recurring nightmares, episodes of confusion, and growing obsession with control. The system she had helped create was shaping her own psyche in ways she didn't fully understand. The arrival of spring 1856 brought new births and new sales. Babies were now treated as pure commodities, with Arthur establishing prices based on physical characteristics and future work potential. It was a commodification of human life that reached almost incomprehensible levels of cruelty. Dorothy observed baby sales with growing attention, studying mothers' reactions in ways Hattie would later describe as disturbing. Her fascination with the separation process revealed a mind being gradually corrupted by the logic of the system she had helped create. Dorothy's transformation from reluctant wife to efficient system administrator was almost complete. She had found a form of power and purpose in a world that traditionally offered few options for women in her position. But this transformation would require sacrifices from her that she didn't yet fully understand. Arthur, encouraged by the relative financial success of his operation, began making even more ambitious plans. Evidence suggests he spoke about expanding to other properties, about creating a network of human nurseries throughout Alabama. It was a grandiose vision of industrialized cruelty that revealed how completely he had lost touch with his humanity. The end of 1856 found Cypress Bend established as a successful operation in the perverse terms Arthur had established. But success had cost the souls of everyone involved, creating an environment of systematic degradation that would set the stage for even more disturbing events to come. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this investigation. We still have much more to discover about Cypress Bend's dark secrets. The year 1856 marked a fundamental transformation in Cypress Bend's power dynamics when Dorothy Claybornne made a decision that would irreversibly alter the course of events. Observing Isidore's reproductive success with the other women, she began contemplating a possibility that initially horrified her, using her own body to generate the heir Arthur could never give the Claybornne family. Correspondence fragments found decades later reveal that the idea germinated slowly in Dorothy's mind during the winter months. Her reflections show a woman struggling with concepts of lineage, control, and survival. If Arthur couldn't generate a legitimate heir, perhaps it was her responsibility to ensure the Claybornne lineage continued even through unconventional means. Dorothy's rationalization was complex and revealing of her psychological transformation. Evidence suggests she didn't view the decision as adultery, but as a necessary strategy to preserve the family's future. In her distorted mind, she would be the true creator of a new Claybornne dynasty, one that would be genetically superior and completely under her control. Arthur surprisingly not only approved Dorothy's decision, but actively encouraged it. For him, a child born of Dorothy and Isidore would technically be a Claybornne, carrying the family name, even if not his blood. It was a solution that preserved his patriarchal facade while exploiting Isidore's proven fertility. However, later records suggest Arthur had secretly planned from the beginning to sell any child born of this union, regardless of it being Dorothy's son. His greed had superseded any genuine family consideration. He feigned enthusiasm about having an heir, but his true intention was to treat even his own wife's child as another commodity. Implementation of the plan required careful reorganization of Cypress Bend's social structure. Dorothy established a specific schedule for her encounters with Isidore, treating conception as a project requiring precision and method. Documents discovered later show she recorded every aspect of the process with disturbing detail. Isidore faced this new demand with the same silent resignation that characterized his existence at Cypress Bend. For him, Dorothy was just another white woman exercising absolute power over his body and life. There was no choice, only survival through submission to increasingly disturbing demands. Dorothy's pregnancy was confirmed in May 1856, an event she celebrated with barely contained euphoria. Records from the time show she viewed this pregnancy as validation of her new vision for Cypress Bend. This child would be raised from birth as heir to her distorted utopia, completely molded by her philosophy and free from external influences. During pregnancy, Dorothy experienced an unexpected emotional transformation. For the first time, she began viscerally understanding what the other women at Cypress Bend felt. The growth of life within her awakened maternal instincts she didn't know she possessed, creating an emotional connection that would dramatically complicate her future plans. The physical and emotional changes of pregnancy also altered Dorothy's perspective on the other women on the property. Later testimonies from Hattie describe how Dorothy began observing them with new understanding, seeing not just reproductive units, but mothers who had lost their children. It was a revelation that would plant the seeds of her eventual transformation. Arthur observed Dorothy's pregnancy with satisfaction that masked his true intentions. Publicly, he spoke about elaborate plans for the child's future, about education and inheritance. But later, evidence reveals he secretly planned to sell the child as soon as it was born, regardless of Dorothy's maternal feelings. The birth of Noah Claybornne in February 1857 was a moment of simultaneous triumph and tragedy. Dorothy experienced overwhelming maternal love that surprised her with its intensity. For the first time since Cypress Bend's operation began, she felt a genuine emotional connection with another human being. It was a feeling that would humanize her again, but also make her more dangerous. Arthur, however, viewed Noah purely in economic terms. The baby represented another source of profit, not a family heir. It was a perspective that would put Arthur on a direct collision course with Dorothy's newly awakened maternal instincts. A collision that would have fatal consequences. The first weeks after Noah's birth were marked by growing tension between Arthur and Dorothy. Hattie's accounts describe how Dorothy refused to leave the baby alone, carrying him constantly and resisting any suggestion that he be treated like the other children born at Cypress Bend. Arthur initially tolerated this behavior, attributing it to postpartum whims. Dorothy began nursing Noah personally, a decision that shocked Arthur and revealed how profoundly her perspective had changed. She had observed other mothers being forced to hand their babies over to slave wet nurses, but now understood the importance of physical connection between mother and child. It was an understanding that would make her more empathetic, but also more determined to protect her own child. Dorothy's transformation during this period was documented through observations from other Cypress Bend residents. For the first time, she truly understood maternal love as a force that transcended reason, morality, even survival. It was a revelation that would prepare her for acts of extreme violence in defense of her child. Arthur began pressuring Dorothy to resume her administrative functions at Cypress Bend, arguing that her obsession with Noah was harming operational efficiency. He suggested the baby be cared for by Hattie, freeing Dorothy to supervise other pregnant women. It was a suggestion Dorothy rejected with growing vehemence. Dorothy's resistance to Arthur's demands created the first real fissure in their partnership. He began questioning whether she had become excessively sentimental, a weakness that could compromise the entire system they had built. Dorothy, in turn, began seeing Arthur as a potential threat to Noah's well-being. In April 1857, Arthur made the decision that would seal his fate. Taking advantage of a moment when Dorothy was ill with fever, he sold Noah to a slave trader from Mobile. The 2-month-old baby was torn from Cypress Bend while his mother was unconscious, a betrayal that would destroy any vestige of loyalty Dorothy still felt for her husband. The discovery of Noah's sale transformed Dorothy into something fundamentally different. Hattie's accounts of the following days describe a woman in total psychological collapse, alternating between episodes of homicidal rage and catatonic depression. Arthur had stolen more than her child. He had stolen her soul, and now he would pay the price. Dorothy's pain was amplified by understanding that she had actively participated in creating the system that now victimized her. She had watched other mothers lose their children with clinical coldness, never truly understanding the magnitude of their pain. Now that pain was hers, and it consumed her completely. Hattie emerged as a crucial figure during this period, offering Dorothy the only comfort available at Cypress Bend. The older woman had lost her own children decades before, and recognized in Dorothy's pain a reflection of her own tragedy. It was a connection that would plant the seeds of a dangerous alliance. Dorothy began questioning not only Arthur, but the entire system they had created. Later, evidence shows a woman confronting the magnitude of her own complicity in creating a horror that now victimized her. Her previous blindness from greed and fear now transformed into terrible clarity about the monster she had become. Dorothy's transformation from efficient administrator to traumatized victim created a power vacuum at Cypress Bend that Arthur tried to fill by assuming direct operational control. But he lacked Dorothy's organizational competence, and operational efficiency began declining rapidly. The other women at Cypress Bend observed Dorothy's transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and terror. They had suffered under her supervision, but also recognized that her protection had been crucial to their survival. Now they faced the prospect of dealing directly with Arthur, a possibility that terrified them. Isidore, Noah's biological father, observed events with his characteristic external stoicism. But his actions revealed deep understanding of the changing dynamics. Later testimonies describe how he began spending more time near the grand house, positioning himself to protect Dorothy if necessary. It was loyalty that transcended Cypress Bend's formal power structures. During the summer of 1857, Dorothy began planning her revenge against Arthur. Evidence fragments reveal a calculating mind working through various possibilities, from direct confrontation to more subtle methods of retaliation. Arthur needed to pay, but his death should appear natural, or everything they had built would be lost. Dorothy's decision to poison Arthur was made gradually through whispered conversations with Hattie about herbs and their properties. The older woman possessed extensive knowledge about native Alabama poisonous plants, information she shared with Dorothy under the pretext of protection against garden pests. Arthur's poisoning began in September 1857, a slow and meticulous process Dorothy executed with surgical precision. She used small doses of poison extracted from local plants administered through Arthur's food and drink over several weeks. It was a method that mimicked natural diseases, protecting Dorothy from suspicion. Arthur began falling ill gradually, developing symptoms he attributed to the stress of managing Cypress Bend. He suffered from abdominal pain, progressive weakness, and episodes of mental confusion that Dorothy observed with cold satisfaction. Justice was finally coming to Cypress Bend, and Arthur was reaping what he had sown. Arthur's death in December 1857 was officially attributed to natural causes. A conclusion no one questioned given Cypress Bend's isolated nature. Dorothy wept publicly at his funeral, a performance that convinced the few neighbors present of her conjugal devotion. Internally, she celebrated her freedom and planned Cypress Bend's future under her absolute control. Arthur Clayborne's death in December 1857 marked the beginning of a new era at Cypress Bend. An era that would be defined by Dorothy's progressive mental deterioration and the property's gradual decline. As a widow, she inherited absolute legal control over the plantation. But her capacity to exercise that control was severely compromised by the trauma of losing Noah. The first months after Arthur's death were chaotic. Dorothy alternated between periods of profound lethargy and manic activity explosions. She dismissed the few free workers still remaining on the property, not by strategy, but because she could no longer handle the presence of strangers. Her growing paranoia made her see threats in any outsider. To resolve growing financial problems, Dorothy made the decision to sell parcels of Cypress Bend's less productive lands. The property had lost much of its value due to years of neglect, but there were still buyers interested in cheap land for expansion. These sales provided some temporary economic stability, but also significantly reduced the property's size. Dorothy made the decision to suspend baby sales not from altruism but from a mixture of trauma and control obsession. She could no longer bear the idea of separating mothers from children but also wanted to keep all children under her constant surveillance. It was a decision that confused the mothers who didn't know whether they should feel relief or concern. Hattie became the only person Dorothy trusted completely. The older woman had become not just a confidant, but practically the property's real administrator. Dorothy increasingly depended on Hattie to make practical decisions about Cypress Bend's daily life. While she lost herself in obsessions and fantasies, Dorothy's second pregnancy was confirmed in March 1858, an event she saw as a second chance at motherhood. This time, she was determined to protect her child from any threat, real or imaginary. Her paranoia intensified during pregnancy and she began seeing conspiracies everywhere. During pregnancy, Dorothy intensified her efforts to isolate Cypress Bend from the outside world. She discouraged neighbor visits and instructed all residents to avoid contact with strangers. When questioned about changes on the property, she spread vague rumors about contagious diseases, a strategy that worked to keep the curious away. To maintain some functionality on the reduced property, Isidore assumed responsibility for making occasional trips to distant towns to buy essential supplies. He maintained a small subsistence plantation that provided basic food for residents, but production was limited and barely managed to adequately sustain everyone. The birth of Aaron Clayborne in September 1858 was a moment of intense joy for Dorothy, but also marked the beginning of her deepest obsession. She refused to leave the baby alone for more than a few minutes, carrying him constantly and sleeping with him in her bed. It was maternal love that had become pathological. Dorothy established Aaron in the grand house's best room, decorating it with obsessive care. She spent significant amounts on imported toys, clothes, and furniture, creating a luxurious environment that contrasted dramatically with the rest of the property's deterioration. It was as if her entire world had been reduced to this single room and this single child. The other children at Cypress Bend received inconsistent attention from Dorothy. On her good days, she tried to teach them basic reading and simple arithmetic. On her bad days, she ignored them completely or treated them with suspicion, as if they were potential threats to Aaron. There was no curriculum or educational system, just the whims of an unstable mind. Dorothy began referring to herself as the true mother of all children, but her attention was clearly focused on Aaron. The biological mothers watched with growing concern as their own children were gradually marginalized in favor of Dorothy's favorite son. It was a dynamic that created tension and silent resentment. Daily routine at Cypress Bend became erratic and unpredictable. Dorothy established rules she constantly changed, created schedules she abandoned the next day, and made promises she quickly forgot. The children learned to navigate her emotional instability, becoming hypervigilant to her moods. Punishments for disobedience were inconsistent and often disproportionate. Dorothy could ignore serious behaviors one day and explode over minor infractions the next. Her unpredictability created an environment of constant anxiety where no one knew what to expect. Cypress Bend's isolation intensified gradually but wasn't complete. Local authorities occasionally visited for tax or census matters, but Dorothy had learned to present a facade of normalcy during these visits. She kept Aaron hidden and instructed everyone else to remain invisible, creating the impression of normal property decline. The property's physical conditions began deteriorating significantly. Without adequate supervision, and with limited resources, fields were neglected, buildings began needing repairs, and the plantation's general infrastructure entered decline. Dorothy was so focused on Aaron that she completely ignored these practical needs. Isidore gradually assumed more property maintenance responsibilities. Not by official designation, but by practical necessity. He recognized that someone needed to keep Cypress Bend functioning, even minimally. His relationship with Dorothy became distant and formal. She tolerated him as Aaron's biological father, but never completely trusted him. The adult women at Cypress Bend lived in a state of constant uncertainty. Dorothy treated them sometimes as family members, sometimes as potential threats. They learned to remain invisible when possible, caring for their children discreetly and avoiding drawing attention to themselves. Dorothy developed a series of personal superstitions and rituals related to Aaron's protection. She constantly checked if he was breathing, tested his food for imaginary poisons, and created elaborate physical barriers around his crib. It was behavior that revealed a mind increasingly disconnected from reality. Cypress Bend's library was neglected during this period. Dorothy had lost interest in reading or formal education, focusing all her energy on Aaron. Books accumulated dust while she spent hours watching her son sleep, looking for signs of danger that existed only in her imagination. The property's finances began gradually depleting. Dorothy spent impulsively on items for Aaron while neglecting the property's basic needs. She had no financial administration skills and increasingly depended on Hattie for practical money decisions. During 1860, some of the older children tried to escape from Cypress Bend, but were quickly recaptured by Isidore, who feared the consequences if Dorothy discovered. These escape attempts revealed growing discontent among residents, but also the practical impossibility of leaving the property without resources or destination. The arrival of 1861 found Cypress Bend in a state of controlled decline. The property still functioned, but only because Hattie and Isidore had assumed responsibilities Dorothy could no longer exercise. It was a community held together not by strong leadership, but by mutual survival necessity. Dorothy had become an increasingly isolated and unstable figure, obsessed with Aaron and distrustful of everyone else. Her transformation from submissive wife to paranoid widow illustrated how unresolved trauma can completely erode a person's capacity to function in reality. Growing tensions in the country over the slavery question seemed completely irrelevant to Cypress Bend residents. They lived in a world apart, governed by the whims of a woman who had lost contact with any reality beyond her distorted maternal obsession. Cypress Bend's isolation wasn't the product of strategic planning, but the result of Dorothy's growing inability to deal with the outside world. It was a gradual retreat from reality that would set the stage for the catastrophic events to come when the outside world would finally force its entry into this artificial refuge. The year 1863 brought distant echoes of the Civil War. But for Cypress Bend residents, the conflict that really mattered was much more personal and immediate. Dorothy Claybornne had spent 5 years building her isolated world, shaping Aaron as the center of an increasingly smaller universe. Now the outside world would finally come to collect the price of her isolation. The first indications of trouble came through rumors brought by Isidore during his supply-buying trips. He spoke of armed groups roaming Alabama. Confederate deserters, fugitive slave hunters, local militias that had lost any semblance of official discipline. For these desperate men, isolated properties like Cypress Bend represented easy looting opportunities. Dorothy received this news with a mixture of paranoia and terror. In her fragmented mind, external threats confirmed all her fears about the dangerous world beyond Cypress Bend. She intensified her surveillance over Aaron. Now 5 years old, carrying him constantly and refusing to let him play outside her sight. Aaron had grown as a strange and isolated child, knowing only the claustrophobic world Dorothy had created. He spoke little, observed much, and demonstrated pathological dependence on his mother that worried even Hattie. The boy had never played with other children normally, or experienced any form of healthy social life. The other children at Cypress Bend, now totaling 6 between ages 7 and 10, had grown in an environment of inconsistent neglect. They received basic care from their biological mothers, but lived under the shadow of Dorothy's obsession with Aaron. Some showed signs of delayed development due to lack of adequate stimulation. Isidore, now almost 50, had become Cypress Bend's true administrator by necessity. He kept the fields functioning minimally, cared for the few remaining animals, and supervised basic repairs needed to keep the property habitable. His relationship with Dorothy was tense and formal. She tolerated him as Aaron's biological father, but never completely trusted him. Hattie, despite her advanced age, remained the only person capable of reasoning with Dorothy during her most severe episodes. The elderly woman had essentially become substitute mother to all children, including Aaron, when Dorothy was in her periods of profound depression. The children's biological mothers lived in a state of silent resignation. They had learned to navigate Dorothy's unpredictable moods, protecting their children when possible and remaining invisible when necessary. Their existence had been reduced to basic survival in an increasingly unstable environment. During autumn 1863, danger signs intensified. Smoke from burned properties could be seen on the horizon, and occasionally distant echoes of gunshots reached Cypress Bend residents' ears. Dorothy responded to these threats by locking herself in the grand house with Aaron, refusing to leave, even for the most basic necessities. Preparation for possible attacks revealed how little Cypress Bend was equipped to defend itself. Dorothy possessed 2 old hunting rifles and some pistols in questionable condition. More importantly, no one on the property had real military experience or knowledge of defensive tactics. Dorothy established a primitive surveillance system, assigning the older children to watch access roads. It was too heavy a responsibility for 7 to 10-year-olds who frequently got distracted or fell asleep at their posts. The system was more theater than real protection. A desperate attempt to create security where none existed. The weapons available at Cypress Bend were inadequate and poorly maintained. Dorothy had neglected their maintenance for years, and several were rusted or had defective mechanisms. Even if there had been competent defenders, the arsenal was insufficient to repel any serious attack by men experienced in combat. In December 1863, Dorothy's fears materialized when one of the children reported suspicious movement in surrounding forests. A group of about 8 armed men had been seen camping less than 2 miles from the property, clearly conducting reconnaissance before a planned attack. It was the confrontation Dorothy had feared, but for which she was completely unprepared. The night of December 22, 1863 would be remembered as the final moment in Cypress Bend's history. A winter storm had begun at dusk, creating perfect conditions for a surprise attack. The invaders, estimated at about 8 men, approached the grand house under cover of rain and darkness. Dorothy had tried to position her defenders around the property, but reality was chaotic and desperate. The older children hid on the grand house's upper floors, terrified and unable to use weapons properly. Adults spread through external buildings, but without coordination or real defense plan. The first sign of attack came when one of the children screamed upon seeing movement in the trean. Dorothy responded by entering total panic, grabbing Aaron and running to the grand house's safest room. Within minutes, any pretense of organized defense completely collapsed. The attackers found little real resistance, expecting to find a property defended only by defenseless women and children. They discovered their assessment was essentially correct. The first shots came from the grand house's upper windows, but were poorly aimed and ineffective against men who knew how to move in combat. Dorothy briefly emerged from the grand house, carrying Aaron and a rifle she barely knew how to use. Her appearance was more desperate than heroic, a terrified woman trying to protect her son with inadequate resources. For the defenders, she wasn't an inspiring leader, but a reminder of how lost they were. The battle that followed was brief and one-sided. The invaders, despite being only 8 men, had military experience and superior weapons. Cypress Bend's children didn't fight with trained ferocity. They hid, cried, and tried to escape. It was brutal reality that exposed Dorothy's fantasy about her ability to protect her family. Isidore tried to organize some resistance, but was quickly overwhelmed by younger, better-armed men. He fought courageously, but his age and equipment limitations made his efforts useless. He fell defending the grand house entrance, a death that at least had dignity amid the chaos. Hattie, recognizing the futility of resistance, made the decision that would save at least one life. She grabbed Aaron from Dorothy's hands and dragged him to a hiding place she had prepared. A hidden cellar under the kitchen that was stocked with basic supplies. It was a refuge that would allow the child to survive, even if everyone else perished. Dorothy, seeing Aaron being taken, tried to follow them, but was intercepted by one of the attackers. She fought desperately, not with military skill, but with the fierce desperation of a mother protecting her child. It was a brief struggle that ended with Dorothy gravely wounded. But Aaron was safe in the hiding place. Dorothy's death was slow and painful. She spent her last hours calling for Aaron, not knowing he was safe just a few yards away. Hattie remained with the child in the hiding place, covering his mouth to prevent his cries from revealing their location. It was a silent and terrifying vigil. Of the 6 children living at Cypress Bend, only 3 survived the attack. 2 of the older ones managed to escape to the forest during the initial chaos, while Aaron remained hidden with Hattie. The other 3 children, along with their mothers, perished in the violence that swept the property. The dawn of December 23 revealed the extent of devastation at Cypress Bend. The grand house was partially burned. Bodies scattered across the property testified to the attack's brutality. Dorothy Claybornne lay dead in the main corridor, surrounded by the debris of her artificial world. Hattie emerged from the hiding place with Aaron only after being certain the attackers had left. She found a property transformed into ruins with only 2 other surviving children hidden at various points on the property. Of the 14 people who had lived at Cypress Bend, only 4 had survived. Cypress Bend survivors faced brutal reality. They couldn't remain on the destroyed property, but also had no obvious place to go. Hattie, now over 70, assumed responsibility for caring for Aaron and the other surviving children. It was a heavy burden for an elderly woman, but she was all that remained of Dorothy's distorted family. The journey away from Cypress Bend was difficult and dangerous. Hattie took the children to a freedmen community that had formed nearby. A group of former slaves who had created a precarious but functional settlement. It was the beginning of a new life for the remnants of Dorothy's failed social experiment. Aaron grew up carrying deep scars from his childhood at Cypress Bend. He vaguely remembered the battle and Dorothy's death, but the memories were fragmented and traumatic. Under Hattie's care, he gradually learned to interact with other children and function in a normal community, but never completely recovered from his first years of isolation. The other surviving children adapted more easily to normal life. They were younger when Cypress Bend was destroyed and had fewer specific memories of Dorothy's obsession. Over time, they integrated into the freedmen community and developed relatively normal lives. Hattie lived to almost 80, always caring for Aaron as if he were her own grandson. She rarely spoke about the events at Cypress Bend, preferring to leave the past buried. When she died in 1873, she took with her most of the secrets about the true extent of Dorothy's madness. Cypress Bend property was abandoned after the attack, gradually being reclaimed by nature. The grand house, partially destroyed by fire, became a haunted skeleton that served as silent reminder of the events that had occurred there. No buyer was interested in the property, which carried a dark reputation in the region. Aaron disappeared into the freed men community that welcomed the survivors. His fate lost to history like so many others who emerged from slavery's horrors. The trauma of his early years at Cypress Bend had marked him permanently. But whether he found peace or continued to struggle with those demons remains unknown. He was one of countless children whose lives were shattered by the breeding farm system. Their stories largely unrecorded and forgotten. The complete truth about Cypress Bend's operations may never be fully known. What we do know comes from scattered testimonies and the few survivors who eventually spoke about their experiences. These fragments paint a picture of systematic cruelty that was replicated across countless plantations throughout the antebellum South. Dorothy Clayborne's legacy remains profoundly disturbing because she willingly became an architect of horror. Together with Arthur, she designed and implemented a system of human breeding that treated people as livestock. Her transformation from reluctant participant to obsessive administrator reveals the depths of cruelty that humans can embrace when profit and power are at stake. The loss of her own child to the very system she helped create was not tragic irony. It was inevitable justice. The true horror of Cypress Bend lies in how it represented a widespread systematic approach to human exploitation that was considered profitable business practice. Dorothy and Arthur chose to participate in and expand upon existing brutalities, making calculated decisions to torture, rape, and sell human beings for financial gain. Their story serves as a reminder that evil often comes not from madness, but from the cold, rational choices of people who value money over human life. The story of Cypress Bend forces us to confront one of the darkest realities in American history. Breeding farms, where human beings were treated like breeding livestock in a system of industrial dehumanization. Dorothy Clayborne didn't invent this practice. She simply applied methods that already existed on plantations throughout the South, revealing the terrifying extent of slavery's systematic brutality. Women like Lena, Beatrice, Sarah, and Rebecca represented thousands of victims forced into mass reproduction to feed the slave market. Isidore symbolizes the enslaved men compelled to participate in systematic violation, one of slavery's most perverse cruelties, forcing its victims to become instruments of their own oppression. The mother-child separations we witnessed at Cypress Bend happened daily in slave markets from Charleston to New Orleans. Hutty represents the silent resistance that existed on all plantations. Knowledge of herbs to relieve pain to offer some control over bodies that legally didn't belong to them. Her dignity amid horror illustrates the humanity that persisted even under the most dehumanizing conditions, a force that no system could completely break. Slavery didn't just brutalize its direct victims. It poisoned the entire society that allowed it. Arthur and Dorothy began as desperate people, but the system transformed them into monsters capable of selling babies and torturing families. The corruption was total, infecting perpetrators and victims in vicious cycles of violence. Cypress Bend's final destruction serves as a metaphor for slavery's moral unsustainability. A system based on total dehumanization was destined for collapse. Not for economic reasons, but because it violated fundamental principles of human dignity. The approaching civil war would be the national reckoning with this moral contradiction. The legacy of Aaron and the survivors illustrates how slavery's trauma perpetuated through generations. Multiplied by millions, this collective trauma shaped entire communities and continues influencing our society today. The scars of this violence still mark our nation, transmitted through structural inequality and systemic injustice. Cypress Bend represents thousands of similar sites scattered across the South, places where humanity was systematically destroyed in the name of profit. Many of these sites were never documented. Their stories lost along with the lives they destroyed. This story speaks for all victims whose voices were silenced. Cypress Bend's true lesson isn't about individual madness, but about how entire societies can become complicit in atrocities when they normalize dehumanization. It's an eternal warning about the dangers of systems that treat some human beings as less than human. A lesson that remains painfully relevant today, echoing through time as a cry of warning to humanity. What secrets from the past do you think still lie buried in forgotten places across America? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this investigation into the darkest corners of history intrigued you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are many more untold stories waiting to be uncovered. Truth is often stranger and more terrifying than fiction.